Thank you very much indeed, Erica, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to open this tastily named Dead Friday, and thank you for overcoming any reservations you might have had about a talk that focuses on the view from my corpse. In fact, I hope you will be pleasantly surprised, because what I have to say will be less about death than a celebration of life. What is in offer? And I'm going to press the knob here, make sure the knob behaves itself. Let me just... Yes. What is on offer in the short and necessarily rather fragmentary address is basically fragments of an obituary for life. And two ideas guide my talk, and indeed the book from which it's derived. The first is from E.M. Forster. Death destroys a man, but the idea of it might save him. And for man, of course, read woman. The second is from the sundial on York Minster. Lucem demonstrat umbra. The shadow or the darkness shows forth or underlines the light. The Black Mirror is motivated by the idea that if we look at our days from a standpoint outside of them, not only will we maybe see them more clearly, but the shining hour might shine more brightly in our thoughts. By the way, you haven't accidentally stumbled into a sermon. I'm a humanist and an atheist, so you can relax. There won't be any collection at the end of the talk. Now, the specimen life that I examine is that of this character, Raymond Tallis, seen here as he looked in the days when he walked upright on the surface of the earth. We shall call him RT, because he's only really an example, an exemplar of HS or Homo sapiens. He's anyone, no one in particular, all of us in general. And my choice of him is due only to the accident that I happen to have been him for a few decades. The life portrayed in the Black Mirror is yours as much as mine. Indeed, it's all of our lives, viewed from the outside, from the standpoint, or indeed the lie-down point, of this ex-character under a snow barrow of white linen. Or even from the imaginary viewpoint of this pyramid of ashes. That's, by the way, not his best side, nor is it a selfie. And here he is, or will be, in his Sunday best. Now, viewing ourselves from the imaginary standpoint of our corpse is a way of getting a fix on the extraordinary distance between ourselves as pieces of matter, most clearly evident when we're corpses, ourselves as living organisms, and ourselves as persons. The lead role, by a long way, will be taken by the person, as opposed to the organism, as opposed to the piece of inedible meat that this will become en route to even less dignified fates. So I'm going to devote most of what I have to say to him, to the person, which I've already said is really about life rather than death. This is because death is a mere limit to life, a nothing at the boundaries of everything, an omni-ravenous zero, a parasite that borrows any existence it has from that which it cancels. The organism RT, however, is pretty impressive, though it says so myself. It had worked tirelessly on behalf of the story called The Life of RT. It never had a day off until it went on eternity leave. The heart, both familiar and alien, inseparable from his most intimate self, beating out a personal time in an impersonal universe, and yet just another piece of meat, had drawn a dotted line between his beginning and his end, repeating its cycle of diastole and systole nearly 3 billion times. Its 500 million breaths would have sufficed to inflate 20 standard-sized Zeppelins. Less visibly, through the heat exchange that had made it cozy to cozy up to him, he had, in order to maintain his temperature at exactly the right point between absolute zero and that of the interior of the sun, he had donated something of the order of 30 million calories to the outside world. Yet more subtle was the orchestration of the chemical activities inside the individual cells, an extraordinary dialectic of soup and scaffolding, of signals and receptor sites, of enzymes and their substrates, keeping everything nice and steady. Because RT had been in a state of permanent change, but the changes were counteracted by other changes, so he was relatively stable. A friend who had not seen him for 10 years would still recognize him. Such precise organic bookkeeping was astonishing. The water fell, but the waterfall had stayed still. No wonder it's worn out and has had to put its feet up. Now, unlike the corpse, RT was a being in a world outside of him. But there's also a world inside him, and indeed the world he is inside is in part inside him. That mind-bogglingly complex world sported a multitude of spaces opened up by his senses, and multifarious kinds of distances, partitionings, modes of closeness, and hundreds of modes of privacy and publicity, of revelation and concealment. There have been many different sort of spaces. There have been the spaces of his actions, of ownership, the boundless virtual spaces of possibility opened up by language, the togetherness and apartness of the interspace between him and others, and finally, the inner space of the extinguished flame that had been his self. Light and RT had been inseparable. Not for nothing had his conscious existence been described as living daylight. His arc from non-existence to non-existence was through brightness, bounded by the two darknesses of the womb and the tomb. Stretches of light, hyphenated by intervals of darkness, otherwise known as days, were the fundamental clock that had measured out his existence. Indeed, one version of his biography could have been written as a chronicle of lost sunlight, patches of brilliance, memory flares illuminating vanished worlds. The square of sunshine on the nursery floor, bathing a teddy bear's leg, the radiant green of leaf-dappled grass, a spark in the eyes of a loved one, reflecting in miniature the view she is looking at, the old looking light in a cupboard, opened after a long time shut, the evening sun round the ankles of a hedge, elevated above a deep lane, the yellow of sun-drenched stonework in a public square on a hot afternoon, the quiet candescence of the last leaves in a twilit November wood. The Black Mirror celebrates the richness and variety of RT's sensory experiences, but also the astounding way in which these experiences were anchored in and framed by a body that exercised exquisite judgment in knowing how much to be present in its own right in order to tether him to a solid here and now, and yet not to be so obtrusive as to block his access to the world around him. This theme of the spaces of RT's world is immense as the spaces themselves. There's time merely to nod towards the complexity of the physical, psychological, and social geography of his awareness, of his being surrounded, of the endless modes of near and far, of the infinitely varied ways in which his space was divided up, and of the hypersurface of separation between the public and private sphere, between the marketplace and the bedroom, between overcoats and underwear. There was the great divide of the earth from the sky, the divisions of earth into heres of varying size, defining and defined by theirs, matched them, defining in their turn, by horizons of sight and thought, the elsewhere or elsewheres that lay beyond. He'd like to think of the pie charting of his world into a north that reached into the idea of snowy wastes and unheard wind-blown pine trees articulating their desolation, a south of beaches and night cafes and life spilt out into the warm streets with so many barriers melted, or an east where the rising sun was a sense of gigantic possibility, and a west of elegiac tiredness, of conclusion and evening darkening to night, around the world in 4 cliches. He had relished the idea of the complex space trapped within filing cabinets, where abstract themes, localities of the cognitive manifold were allocated their proper place. To think back to the pockets in his boyhood trousers, where half a century before, in the 1950s, halfpennies had cohabited with chewing gum. And there were spaces, inserted into one another, like Russian dolls. By now, you will suspect that your speaker aspires to the unpeeled gaze of an alien, untaking the taken for granted, defamiliarizing the too familiar, in order to celebrate it. And you would be right. As we look at his corpse, still on the slab, it's impossible to imagine, never mind recall, all that he got up to in making his modest contribution to deflecting the course of the events in the universe, in the few decades in which he was one of the unfallen, between first getting up and finally lying down. Self-propulsion by walking had remained the primordial means of transport. As he grew up and was at large, the large that he was at large in got larger. His hithering and dithering ranged from pacing up and down to crossing continents. But even where it was a matter of journeys of hundreds or thousands of miles, they finished off by foot. And did those feet? By heck they did. His ultramarathon between the onset of toddling and the end of doddering would have amounted to at least 150,000 miles, and just running up and down the stairs would have taken him to the top of Everest 150 times. The prime agent of his agency was this item, his hand. There is no limit to what could be said about these extraordinary structures. Those ceaselessly gripping, grasping, grubbing, groping, holding, cupping, catching, pressing, pulling, pushing, squeezing, pinching, tweaking, twiddling, plucking, prizing, picking up and picking down, etc., etc. You get the general message. Their role in shaping, exploring, and communicating with his world, something that could only be gestured towards. The things that RT got up to before he was retired from agency, all are done, required an endless cast of props to assist his actions and transform the world into a kind of home, into his world. The inventory ranged from toothbrush to secateurs, fish slicer and radiator key, textbooks to carjacks, tea towels to road maps, overcoats to printers, a box of cotton buds to continental plug adapters, to a portrait of the poet Baudelaire, looking very sour indeed. One thing that would strike a Martian would be the extent to which so much practical kit was unpractically ornamented. The principle of why walk when you can dance was everywhere in evidence among his possessions. Thus the door knocker transformed into a lion's prey. But don't get me started on the casual surrealism of everyday life. I'll never stop. Let me hurry on to meditate on the beneficent presence in his life of certain substances that undergo more metamorphoses than the poet of it could have imagined. Take glass, with its magical property of being as translucent as water, but as firm as baked clay, as clear as ice, but obdurately unmelting. It was everywhere, in the windows that allowed his gaze to look out while keeping at eyes' length the cold and rain, in lamps where it was fashioned into the cornea of a one-eyed torch, or the transparent peel of a 100-watt bulb, or the frozen spray arrested in its fall of a chandelier, into vulnerably beautiful vessels such as Venetian glasses, adjectivizing an entire city where craftsmanship, artistry, and mystery met, from the sherry-bearing thimble to the ale-bearing yard. Lenses enlarging the very small, revealing worlds within worlds, reeling in the very distant, weaving light from remote places into nearby images, and supported on his nose and ears, sharpening the edges of the world. Sheeted, glass protected the silver of the mirror, a mirror designed to create a virtual ensuite out of a replica of rooms and of the Verismo microdramas within them in the form of weightless images. Glass clenched into a paperweight, etched with the image of a foreign city. Deftly shattered, it was the stuff of marbles, beads, necklaces, and jewels. And it lay at the heart of the camera that gave the visual skins of moments a taxidermic afterlife in which the snapped and shot could be looked at indefinitely. Of course, we've scarcely touched on his mountain of stuff, and there are many tales to be told about the transience of even the most seemingly permanent fixtures and fittings, such as this tower block, crumbling like a dunked biscuit after a splinter-second pause of disbelief, before the life spaces, snuggeries, and cozy places of thousands are reduced to rubble, dust, and smoke. RT had spent much of his life communicating or attempting to, and reading or attempting to read others' communications, for his world was a semiosphere, a place of signs, supplementing the biosphere in which the organism RT engaged with the material world. According to the experts, his types of gestures amounted to many thousands. His macroscopic facial expressions were supplemented by countless micro-expressions, to a grand total, according to Paul Ekman, of perhaps 3,000. He had exchanged possibly 30 million words with Mrs. RT, and you may guess how the word count was divided. And as for written words, well, they would run into tens of millions. Any discussion of togethering must begin with a certain amount of navel-gazing, because it illustrates something that should be at the center of any inquiry into his being with others, namely the inseparability of being together and being apart. He started as an ingrowth of another's body, and it was only when he was delivered as a separate being that he could forge relationships through others, with others. A relationship requires two relata. Togetherness requires apartness. You did not need the not yet dead RT to tell you that, but following out the consequences of this obvious truth, or blind spot at the heart of togetherness, suggests that we, who think we at times know each other too well, may not know each other at all. RT was something of a blank spot at the heart of all his relationships. His was the one face in the room he could not see. The elusive heart of his world was this, an inner flame, to which we can give many names, but the most straightforward was the self. I confine myself to a few observations. The self is utterly different from the flames that burn in the sun, in forests, or even in the metabolic fires of his own body. It is that in virtue of which the body's heat is felt as warmth, in virtue of which the stars are a distant brightness that have names. It is that which makes matter matter to itself, and makes matter know itself as matter in inverted commas. The things that burn in the flame are extraordinarily rich and varied. Perceptions, emotions, memories, and thoughts. Miracles we take too much for granted. Dancing in the firelight of RT's now extinguished inner flame, we note its mysterious unity in multiplicity at any given time. Its coherence from hour to hour, from week to week, from year to year. Its awareness of its own depth, and the extraordinary pattern of internal stitching that held it, the flame, together, so that RT in 2015 was in communication with RT in 1973, even to the extent of feeling responsible for his actions. Sooner or later, of course, the flame would be snuffed and he would become it. He had found out quite early in his life that he was an accident waiting to unhappen. The unknown, undone, and unlived would be forever unknown, undone, and unlived. The novel he had started to read would be unfinished for eternity, with the bookmark forever between pages 24 and 25. He was ever more sharply defined by choices, habits, modes of attention. His life space widened, and then after a few decades began to shrink. It was increasingly the time for last times. The last time he tied his shoelaces. The last time he was embarrassed by an involuntary release of wind. The last time he attended a reunion, bought a pair of reading glasses from Poundland, enjoyed a sneeze, minded the gap, nipped out for a swift half, felt his left hand warm in his right hand, used the definite article. All the more reason, therefore, to live, so as to avoid the rueful, indeed anguished reflection that Shakespeare put into the mouth of Richard II after he had lost everything. I wasted time, and now doth time waste me. Even so, it's impossible to live so well that one doesn't regret finitude. There seems no right time to die. There's really no such thing as a long life. Even 80 years is less than an eye blink against eternity, and an octogenarian's death is virtually a stillbirth. The Black Mirror does look at some versions of the afterlife, this side of the grave and the other side of the grave, and they're not terribly encouraging. He would like to think he might be preserved in the memory of others. Some others would remember him, but with a few exceptions, and they would be themselves subject to mortality, he would be remembered in rather odd, random ways. Who he? Was he the man who? No, search me. He would be the most likely response to his name. And he could not compete for attention after he died with the demands that life and the living make on the living, and the equally clement demands of the other dead. And just to rub it in, it doesn't matter however long it takes to be entirely forgotten, because in death's dataless night, there's no difference between a short time and a long one. This, then, is his most enduring posthumous portrait, possibly the most flattering he will ever have. Which explains why even he, a self-professed atheist, has toyed with the idea of an afterlife quite different from a precarious existence in the leaky, faithless memories of those who outlive him. But if we rule out the possibility of a reunion of these Smithereens that you can see, and after all it took 13.8 billion years to bring them together in the first place, then we have the unthinkable notion of continuing without a body, which would seem to consist of a collection of negatives, not located in space and time. He would have no here, no there, no elsewhere, no past or future, no near or far, no imaginable needs, no hopes or fears. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I could go on, but I think I've given you enough of the idea of the view from my corpse. And what's more, it's time for me to stop, particularly as some of you may feel you've already experienced eternity over the last 20 minutes. But my final thought is, we may not be able to awaken the dead, but the dead, or the prospect of ourselves among them, may awaken us. Thank you.